All right.
Yeah, John Flanders here, talking to Howie Hawkins, presidential candidate for the Socialist Party and hopefully for the Green Party as well. Howie ran against Mario Cuomo 3 times for governor of New York State. I wanted to talk to him about that, particularly Cuomo, since Cuomo's getting a lot in the national spotlight recently. But first of all, I want to start out by asking him what the situation is in Syracuse, a city where he's lived for a long time up there in central New York. And what their experience has been with the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, Syracuse has not been hammered as hard as New York City, but we do have over 500 cases in the county, over a dozen deaths, a lot of people in the hospital. At this point, the hospitals can handle it, but remains to be seen, how bad it's going to get. And most part, people are pretty much staying locked down, respecting social distancing, except for some of the kids out here. They're out of school and they're having fun on the streets, and I see some of them not practicing social distancing. So I hope, that isn't spreading the virus. But, people seem to have adapted. The big problem is people lost their jobs. And so, the food banks are, operating at capacity, and a lot of people are stressing out. Are they going to be able to pay the rent, the utility bills, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. And people may not realize that Syracuse, I went out and campaigned for you once there, door to door, and Syracuse has real serious pockets of poverty. It can look like Detroit in some places. So I can't even imagine what people are going through there without jobs and access to food.
Yeah, we're always in the top 10 most impoverished cities in the American Community Survey that's done by the U.S. Census Bureau. And we've been as high as the third poorest and always in the top 10. I mean, this is a factory town that's now part of the Rust Belt. So people that used to have, factory jobs, GE, Carrier, Ford, GM, now are doing service work at sometimes a third the income they used to make. So it's depressed, not just economically, but mentally. I mean, their expectations have not been met.
And it's run by a Democratic administration, is it not, historically? And are they doing anything in particular that's outstanding in terms of responding to the crisis?
They're pretty much following the thing that most cities are with the lockdown and urging people to respect the social distancing. I do know they've had the police and fire people, they will talk to people about social distancing, but they're not getting close enough to arrest them. And that's what the mayor told them to do, so they don't get sick. So it's more, advice from the first responders. The city, yeah, it's all Democrats. Actually, the mayor is a quote unquote independent. He's the son of the former Republican member of Congress and the grandson of the former Republican mayor and member of Congress. And he put together a coalition of Republicans, developers, and the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, which was kind of bizarre, but the Democratic nominee had alienated particularly Black officials and staffers in city government. So he was able to pull it off. So he's nominally an independent, and everybody else is a Democrat.
Okay, well, now let's turn to what your experience and knowledge of Cuomo, who has been getting a lot of publicity lately. Could you talk a little bit about his political evolution in New York State over the years? I think you first ran against him in 2010. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's Andrew. You said Mario at the beginning.
Oh, but, sorry. Andrew Cuomo, not Mario.
Yeah, well, we got a family dynasty going on in the state, so I make that mistake sometimes too. Well, yeah, I ran against him in 2010, and that year I was the first candidate in the United States to campaign for a Green New Deal. We were coming out of the Great Recession, and that Green New Deal was as much about economic recovery as climate action. So we had an economic bill of rights, the jobs and income above poverty, housing, healthcare, education, and a secure retirement. And so we led with that and said that the big investments in transitioning to a 100% clean energy economy would get the economy moving again. Instead of what Cuomo was advocating, he said in 2010 he was the real Tea Party candidate. We called my plan the Hawkins prosperity plan versus the Cuomo austerity plan. And, Cuomo felt he could basically move to the right because he didn't respect what the Greens might get. And the Republican was a guy named Carl Palladino, a real estate developer like Trump, who's probably even more virulently and explicitly racist. So Palladino, was very marginal in that race. And Cuomo got elected. And then in 2014, we had a rerun. I was the Green candidate, Cuomo was the Democratic candidate. And we had issues. I've been campaigning for a ban on fracking since before I ran in 2010. And that became a huge issue. Common Core and the high stakes testing became a big issue in that campaign. And we continued to campaign for an economic bill of rights with particular demands like a $15 minimum wage and paid family leave. And lo and behold, I ended up with 5% of the vote in 2014. And Andrew wanted to get more votes than his father, Mario, had got. Because Andrew wanted to run for president. He wanted to get more votes than he got in 2010. And he got less. And he had to say, wow, what were the Greens talking about? How do I get those votes? He had to compete for our votes. He couldn't take us for granted. And so to our surprise, he agreed to a ban on fracking. He agreed to $15 minimum wage on a slower schedule than we wanted, but we're moving that way. Paid family leave. He even made a gesture toward tuition-free higher education, had Bernie Sanders come out when he rolled out his Excelsior scholarship. Now, that was anything but tuition-free. It's a top-off scholarship that very few of the SUNY and CUNY students have been able to even take advantage of. But the point is, our 5% moved the agenda. And so after that, Cuomo, instead of being the center-right, real Tea Party candidate, became what he called himself, the progressive, the pragmatic progressive. So he ran more progressive, but the reality is he's still basically the same old Andrew Cuomo. Look at this budget that just passed. They cut Medicaid in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. And he was planning to cut it $2.5 billion, which is about 10% of the budget. 1/3 of New Yorkers are on Medicaid. And when we got to this COVID-19 crisis, he had presided over what began before him under Pataki, a Republican, but he continued streamlining our for-profit medical system. So we lost 41 hospitals in this century. We lost, since 2000, we lost 21,000 hospital beds. And, they're running a lean operation. If you're for-profit, you don't want excess capacity in case of an emergency. And so when the COVID-19 crisis, he had to scramble to get the resources. Well, he set himself up for that. And that's the problem with these austerity politics. I mean, he still will not entertain raising taxes on the rich. Like, why don't we reinstitute the stock transfer tax, which brings between $6 and $16 billion in a year? It's still collected. It's been around since the early 1900s, but it's been rebated 100% to the stock traders since 1981. I mean, right there, you could have money, and have a real fiscal crisis now. We should keep that money. And it's pennies on a trade. It's not really going to hurt the stock traders, but it's a lot of money for the state. And so, so I wrote a piece called Andrew Cuomo, Austerity Autocrat, because not only did he use the coronavirus crisis to impose an austerity budget with respect to healthcare, education, and he got the right to do further cuts in the course of the campaign without consulting the legislature. He got the legislature to pass a new rule that says if you want to vote against something, you have to be present in the chamber. But if you want to vote for it, you can do it remotely. Now, there's at least 5 people in the assembly that are infected with the COVID-19 crisis. It's not like the assembly members want to go down there, to vote no. So he's able to ram things through, including tripling the ballot qualification requirements for third parties. And that was something he tried to sneak in through this commission they set up to write a public financing law. And we got that thrown out in court because, the New York Constitution says the legislature makes laws, not commissions appointed by a legislature. That was like 2 weeks before the budget was adopted. So he just snuck it into the budget. So now in this election, for the Green Party to stay on the ballot, we need to get basically 3 times as many votes as we used to. We used to have to get 50,000 votes during gubernatorial races. Now we've got to get 135,000 or 2%, whichever is greater, which in a presidential election is going to be well over 150,000 votes. And we got to do it during a presidential election, and then 2 years later, a gubernatorial election, and then a presidential election. So we have to do it twice as frequently. And if we fail, we have to get 3 times more signatures in the 6 weeks window we have to do an independent nominating petition. So instead of 15,000 good signatures in 6 weeks, we got to get 45,000. Now, the only Green candidates who ever got over 150,000 in New York State were Ralph Nader in 2000 and me in 2014. So as the New York Times headline said, when this first was revealed that, Cuomo was trying to sneak this through that commission, they said the Democrats' secret plan to kill third parties. So that's what he did under the cover of the coronavirus crisis. So, he looks, compared to that idiot in the White House, whose, sociopathic narcissism comes out every day. It's all about him. He doesn't care about us. Cuomo looks pretty good. But we got to put that in perspective. He set himself up for having to scramble for the resources to deal with this pandemic. And under the cover of this pandemic, he's attacking democracy and he's cutting Medicaid. So, that's the real Andrew Cuomo.
Well, could you comment? I mean, the media has made it sound like this was all about the Working Families Party and Cuomo. Could you comment on the role of the Working Families Party in this whole history?
Yeah, I think I'll give Working Families Party props. They are able to get in the media and tell their narrative. And it's true. Andrew Cuomo is irritated by Working Families Party. They supported the progressive senators, Democrats, against, his centrist Democrats in the Senate. And he's not happy that the Democrats control the Senate, because before he could play the Republicans in the Senate off against the Democrats in the Assembly, so he didn't have to do more progressive things. So he's irritated. But, in the gubernatorial races, they endorsed him in 2010. They endorsed him in 2014. Zephyr Teachout ran against him, but that wasn't the Working Families Party. So finally in 2018, they backed Cynthia Nixon. And as soon as she lost 2-1, they endorsed Andrew Cuomo. So Andrew Cuomo doesn't take votes. I mean, the Working Families Party doesn't take votes from Andrew Cuomo in the end. It's the Green Party. And I think a lot of the, journalists, when they write these stories, they don't understand that. What really counts for Cuomo is votes. I think that's why he had to move after 2014 when we got 5% of the vote.
Now, I want to just talk a little bit about where you see things heading in the presidential race and your role in it and so on. I mean, Bernie Sanders has pretty much folded up his tent and joined the Biden bandwagon. Obama got in it as well. And I'm sure the pressure on the liberal left is going to be overwhelming to do likewise. I'm arguing personally, and this is not, I'm not saying this is any party's position, but my position is that in response to, say, Bill McKibben, who is pleading with the Greens to not run a presidential campaign in the hopes of getting ranked choice voting, which I know you know a lot about. My argument with McKibben, and I wrote a piece about it on my Facebook page, is that the only way the Democrats or the Republicans will ever concede to ranked choice voting in the United States is if they can't win any other way. In other words, we have to spoil an election for them. What do you think about that? And what's your perspective as a Socialist Party candidate, presidential candidate, and also running for the Green Party nomination?
Yeah, well, he called me out in that article in the New Yorker you're referring to. And I tweeted right back at him. I said, if the Greens don't run, ranked choice voting in a national popular vote for president, which is our demand, will not even be raised. So if you want that, it's the Greens is the way to, voting for the Greens is the way to push that demand forward. I also pointed out that, as a climate activist, he should understand that it's only the Greens that have been fighting fracking. Take Pennsylvania, where they're fracking the hell out of the state. And we have a ban in New York, but we're importing frack gas under Andrew Cuomo for these gas-fired power plants and these new pipelines. And it's only the Greens in Pennsylvania that oppose fracking. Same thing in Ohio. The Democrats are for it. And I said, if the Greens are not in the race, we're left with the all of the above energy policy, which he opposes, but the Democrats reaffirmed in 2018 after he helped get it out of their platform in 2016 as a Sanders delegate. And so they went backwards. And all of the above means fracking the hell out of the whole country so we can be the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. That's a climate disaster. So, if you're a climate activist, the only way to advance your demands is to vote for the Greens. And yeah, this has been going on since Nader ran in 2000. I mean, I also got called out by, a bunch of intellectuals like Noam Chomsky and Barbara Ehrenreich and so forth. They had an open letter saying I should only run in the safe states and ignore the battleground states. And my answer to that was every state is a battleground for the Greens. I mean, Pennsylvania and Ohio are battleground states, and we're fighting fracking, and Democrats are on the other side. And we have a huge housing crisis in this country. 500,000 people in the midst of this pandemic are out on the streets. They're homeless. And there's no program to house them, not coming from the Democrats. And when we fight for affordable housing, like we want rent control, we want more public housing, the Democrats are on the other side of those fights. Real estate and developers are the finances behind Democratic machines in the cities. And they want us to stand down and not fight for those things? No, every state's a battleground for us. And what we want to do in this election, look, my odds of being president are low. But what we can do is win ballot lines and enable Greens to run more readily for local office and build a base there, and then state office, and then Congress. We got to build this from the bottom up. But the relevance of a presidential campaign is in about 40 of the 50 states, the vote we get for president, or maybe another statewide office with the presidential candidate's coattails helping, determines whether we'll have a ballot line for the next election cycle. And in most states, it's 1, 2, or 3% of the vote. That's within our reach. So that's a concrete objective we can realize to help create the infrastructure of ballot access that enables us to run candidates to challenge these democratic machines in cities, for example, on affordable housing or police brutality. I mean, there's an issue where the crime rate has been declining for 30 years, steadily, on the streets. But the number of police killings has been constant. It's about 1,000 a year. And we set up these review boards. They haven't got the job done. We're calling for community control of the police, the old Black Panther Party demand. And the Democrats are not for that. It's going to have to be an independent party to the left that pushes that forward. So on all these issues, why should we, fold up our tents and disappear when these are life or death issues? The climate is a life or death issue. Inequality is a life or death issue now for the working class. Our life expectancies are declining now. We have a 20-year life expectancy gap between our richest and poorest counties. And we have a program to end poverty and economic despair, the Economic Bill of Rights. Nobody in the Democratic Party, except for Bernie Sanders, and he's out now, and he's backing the guy who opposes Bernie Sanders' program of Medicare for all, a real Green New Deal, an Economic Bill of Rights, medical and college debt relief, and so forth. So, if people want to keep fighting for those kind of programs, it's going to be the green ticket that is their vehicle, because Biden is clearly opposed to those things. He said if he got a Medicare for all bill across his desk as president, he would veto it. He said it was irrelevant to the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, this guy's not on our side. So I think we can do two things. We can get those ballot lines and help create the basis for really building an independent left party. And then we can put issues and force them into the debate, like Medicare for all, like a ranked choice national popular vote for president, like an Economic Bill of Rights. And the issue that nobody's talking about, which is life and death, is this new nuclear arms race. I mean, all these nuclear arms treaties, the U.S. has got out of. The last one, but the last bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Russia is the New START treaty. It expires next February 5th. There are no negotiations going on about that. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved their doomsday clock the closest it's ever been to midnight. So, I'm campaigning, and I think this should be a top issue And none of the presidential candidates, except for Mike Gravel when he was in, made this an issue. And that is the nuclear disarmament initiatives. I think the U.S. should pledge no first use of nuclear weapons, unilaterally disarm to a minimum credible deterrent, and then go to the other nuclear powers and say, on the basis of those tension reducing initiatives, let's negotiate mutual and complete nuclear disarmament, which the rest of the world wants. There was a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the text of which was agreed to by 122 nations in July 2017, just a couple of years ago. And the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And hardly anybody in this country knows about that, because our corporate media makes, never questions the military industrial complex or our foreign and military policy, and none of the presidential candidates are talking about it. So if for no other reason, just to get that issue debated and people thinking about it, we need to be in this race.
Let me ask you one other question. I mean, Trump is talking about reopening the country. He's on a warpath to try to do that. And I know you spent many years in the Teamsters Union unloading trucks for UPS. What do you think workers should, if you were working today, what would you be advocating workers do in response to Trump trying to put everybody's lives at risk, reopening the economy the way he plans to do? What can workers do about that?
Well, I'm still in touch with the fellas I used to unload trucks with. And, they've been, they demanded more paid leave. And the company did grant them extra paid leave in case they're infected. But they've been lax on safety. They spray people when they go in and they have hand sanitizer around, but they're not providing any other protective equipment. They still got 2 guys in the truck huffing and puffing as they get those boxes out. It's not safe. There have been some people who have been infected in the hub up here. So it's a real problem. And, they're stressing out. There have been a lot of job actions around the country. People saying, wildcat strikes saying we want safety equipment. There was a GE plant that was producing, I think, jet engines. They say we want to produce ventilators. So, that's encouraging. But, as far as Trump sending us back out, he wants us to go out and die for the Dow. He doesn't care about us.
Die for the
He
Dow.
doesn't care about us. I mean, there are a lot of Trump supporters here in upstate. And I always, when I run into them and, people know me and they think, they say, Trump, he's going to make a difference. And I say, what he told us in upstate New York twice? If we can't get a job, move. He doesn't care about us. And these Trumpies, they're like, really? He said that? I said, look it up. He did it twice. He doesn't care about us. And so, people got to realize that. I think, COVID-19 is Trump's Katrina. And if I was advising Joe Biden, who is not the, swiftest on his feet, just lay low and let Trump, talk himself, because more and more people are realizing he doesn't have a clue as to what he's doing. If we're going to go back out safety, we got to have widespread testing, and those who are infected, then we need to trace their contacts and then quarantine everybody so it doesn't spread. And instead of invoking the Defense Production Act and bringing in some generals and industry people that know logistics, that's where UPS could help out. So we can produce what we need, get all the supply chain lined up to make that production, and then get it distributed to where we need. It's what we did during World War II. The federal government took over a quarter manufacturing during World War II. They either built it or they took it over from companies like Ford and GM. And they told, the board of directors, just get out of the way. And they planned it through the Office of War Mobilization and later the War Production Board to turn industry on a dime into what they called the arsenal of democracy, which armed the US, the UK, Russia to defeat the Nazis. That's the kind of thing we've done before. And that's why the Defense Production Act is there. And Trump defers to private industry and just jawbones at them instead of putting somebody in charge. So we're not going to have testing. If he wants to go back out May 1st, he wants people to go out and die, for his reelection chances. It's negligent mass murder. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, and they've done a lot to try to dismiss Venezuela as a horror story for socialism and so forth and so on. But in Venezuela, everybody gets food distributed by the government for free. Every so often they ration their food, and their tests are free for the COVID uh, pandemic, and they have the best record in Latin America as far as that goes. I mean, it's just amazing to me that we're going to have to learn from a country like Venezuela that is besieged by the United States and it lacks all kinds of resources, and yet they can do better than we do.
Well, and Biden didn't learn that. Remember that last debate with Sanders? He said Italy had a single payer system and it didn't stop the virus. But South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, they all had single payer systems, and they used that to set up testing, tracing, and quarantining regimes. And they were able to flatten the curve much faster than we were. Italy's a case where they got started late, and also because of conservative governments, they set up competition between private and that public system. Their public system's universal, but their private hospitals, which the upscale people use. And in that competition, what that did was everybody had to do lean production. And that meant they were shorthanded on hospital beds and equipment in hospitals. And that's a problem with a for-profit oriented healthcare system, which means healthcare becomes a buy or die commodity. It's not a right, and you don't have a public planning system where these pandemics, Ralph Nader, he consistently in his stump speeches and, the speeches he gives to college kids, it's always one of his talking points that, this is something that our government is not prepared for. He's been talking about this for decades, and the public health officials have been talking about it for decades. But we don't have a healthcare system that can rationally respond to those warnings and be prepared. And now's the time when we need to catch up. But Biden is saying that's irrelevant. And I think the next industry, or one of the next industries that's going to want to be bailed out, is private health insurance. And you know how they're going to do it? It's going to be Biden's program to expand the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. They're going to increase the subsidies and expand the coverage. So us taxpayers are going to be paying private health insurance at a higher rate with higher subsidies to bail them out, when we should just have a single public payer to pay for medical services for everybody, which is much more efficient. About a third of the dollar we spend now on healthcare goes to the paperwork, because a provider, a doctor, first they got to see if what they want to give you is covered in your insurance, and then they got to fight, if it is covered, to get it paid for. And so there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of paperwork. It's a big mess. It's a waste of, capitalism is supposed to be more efficient. Not here. It's not more efficient in delivering healthcare.
Well, and on top of that, how are people without jobs going to be even pay premiums for the ACA? It's ridiculous. They're not going to be able to.
Well, they'll go on Medicaid, but
they're cutting
everybody from Trump to Cuomo wants to cut Medicaid. Remember, Trump back in January was at Davos talking to the wealthy elite of the world. And that's where he said, if I get reelected, I'm going to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
Yeah. And that's the only thing that's keeping some people afloat. The other thing I would point out, that along with Venezuela, Cuba, which is my particular interest, they have 9 doctors per 1,000 population. The United States is 2. So, and they've mobilized 28,000 medical students from the largest medical school in the world to go out and talk to every single Cuban and take a poll as to what their health is. We have no capability to do that whatsoever, and the testing here has been abysmal.
Well, yeah, and I'm for Medicare for all, but I want it to be a national health service rather than just national health insurance, which is what we've had in Congress as the Medicare for all bill. So national health insurance means the single public payer will pay for medical services, but a lot of those services will be delivered privately by hospital organizations and clinics that are trying to maximize their income. And that gives incentive for unnecessary tests, running people through fast so you can get more fees for service. Whereas if we go to a national health service where the hospitals and clinics are publicly owned, the doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers our public employees and we govern it, and I don't think they do this in Cuba, but we should do it here. This has been in a bill called the Josephine Butler United States Health Service that Ron Dellums introduced back in 1977 and was carried by Barbara Lee after he left in 1997 until 2010 when she dropped it after Obamacare passed. But that provided for, as part of this National Health Service, it'd be governed by a federation of locally elected health boards, where 2/3 of the boards would be elected by the general public at elections and 1/3 by the healthcare workers. And that we need because, take Syracuse here, we have hospitals competing with each other for customers. So they have more MRIs than the city needs. But here on the south side where I live, and half the people don't have cars, they got to walk 2 miles to the community health center or up the hill to the hospitals to get medical care. We have no doctors in this neighborhood, no clinics. With a health board, we could make sure the resources are distributed rationally across the district, and we're not over, purchasing some medical equipment and under providing other things that people need. So my plan is to immediately go to national health insurance first year, and then over the next 10 years, build out this national health service. So we have a public system that is democratically accountable, and it's about healthcare. So doctors can focus on, caring for their patients rather than satisfying the needs of whatever corporate organization they're in to maximize income. So national health services, that's a system. Cuba has one, Costa Rica has one, UK, Italy. The problem in the UK and Italy, I'm not familiar with where Costa Rica's at right now, is you get conservative governments that underfund the health service. So that's another issue. But to me, that's a problem with capitalism, because with a concentrated wealth in the hands of an elite, that translates into concentrated political power. So whatever reforms we win, they're always trying to roll them back, and they're fighting getting them passed in the first place. So, just to make a comment about Bernie Sanders, he was really an old-fashioned liberal. He wanted to tax the billionaires to fund the social programs. We need to democratize wealth. We need a socialist economic democracy so the billionaires don't have concentrated power. And then we can have secure social programs like healthcare. And when we go to work, we'll get the full fruit of our labor instead of just getting a fixed wage and all the surplus value we create going to the ownership class. And they get richer and richer, and we struggle.
I found it particularly ironic that Boris Johnson praised the National Health Service in England after it got out. And, so glad we have a National Health Service and everybody gets served. And yet his party has spent the last few years cutting everything they could and privatizing as much as they could for the National Health Service.
Yeah, and they're sneaky about that, like Cuomo was sneaky here. They praise the National Health Service because the British people love it. Like the Canadian people love their single payer system. But the conservatives, they pay homage to those systems, but then when it comes to the funding, they're nickel and dime them, and that is a problem.
Yeah. Well, Howie, thank you very much for spending some time talking to me. I hope that you prosper in your campaign and don't take too many slings and arrows from the liberals. Don't worry about them too much. Do you have anything you want to end with in terms of the discussion we've had today?
Well, I welcome when people like Noam Chomsky and Bill McKibben call me out, because it raises my profile and I get to respond, and more people hear about what we're talking about. So, have at it, liberals. I'm ready. If people are interested in my campaign, go to howiehawkins.us and you can find out more about what we're saying. You can sign up to get our bulletins about what we're doing. You can volunteer, you can donate, you can get involved. That's howiehawkins.us.
Okay, Howie, thank you very much.